Welcome to this explainer. I am absolutely thrilled you're tuning in today because we are diving deep into the hidden mechanics of the modern financial system. We're going to unpack a massive global phenomenon that affects literally everyone watching, yet is understood by so few. By digging into some incredible on-the-ground reporting and expert analysis, we are going to expose the massive, unseen currents of money flowing around the globe right now.
Okay, so let's jump right in. I want you to just think about this paradox for a second. Never before has there been as much money in the world as there is today. Central banks are continuously pumping unprecedented liquidity. We are talking trillions of dollars and euros into the markets. The system is literally flooded with cash. But if you try to do the responsible thing and open a savings account, it's practically like burning your money. The everyday frustration of zero-interest savings is a reality we all share. So you gotta ask, where exactly is all this cheap money going?
Well, here's our roadmap for today's explainer. First, the cheap money paradox. Second, how banks invent money. Third, the winners, speculators. Fourth, the losers, savers and startups. And finally, number 5, fixing the system. Let's get to it.
Section 1. The cheap money paradox. Trillions in the system, pennies in the bank. To really grasp what this looks like on the ground, take Karl Heinz. He's a recently retired court bailiff in Germany. He's lived a modest life, totally avoided risky investments, and just wanted to safely park a maturing life insurance policy for his retirement. But his local bank's interest rate on savings? A measly 0.01%. That means Karl gets exactly 1 single cent for every $100, actually euros, he puts away, every year. Regular savers are literally getting pennies, while ailing banks and highly indebted countries are being bailed out with an absolute flood of cheap money.
And just to put the sheer shocking scale of this disconnect into perspective, let's look at the global numbers. The total value of all the world's physical cash, it's about 5 trillion euros. The real economy, meaning the value of all the actual goods and services created globally every year, sits at about 75 trillion euros. But then there's the debt, 705 trillion euros. That is the massive balloon of global debts and derivatives. These are speculative financial bets on the future that have almost nothing to do with real tangible goods anymore. It's wild. And impartial experts are definitely sounding the alarm. Economist Max Ott warns that this deluge of cheap money isn't just some harmless side effect. It's a symptom of a much deeper sickness. He points out that this influx basically acts as a gigantic upward redistribution machine. It endangers the whole economy by promoting more and more debt, which is slowly splitting society apart. As he puts it, anyone who thinks we're perfectly safe now that the 2008 crisis has receded is very much mistaken.
Section 2. How banks invent money. Demystifying deposit money creation. So, if there are hundreds of trillions of euros in speculative debt floating around, where is it actually coming from? Well, some university students in Siegen, Germany went out on the street to ask everyday people exactly that. Where does money come from? The answers were pretty sobering. People guessed through work, or the government, or they honestly just had no clue. The truth is, almost nobody knows how money is actually created today. So let's demystify it.
This brings us to a massive public misconception. Textbooks and basic common sense tell us that, a saver puts money in a bank, and then the bank lends that exact same money out to someone buying a house or starting a business, right? Nope. Actually, through a process called deposit money creation, private banks generate most of our new electronic money completely out of thin air. The original spark that creates money comes from private banks whenever someone takes out a loan.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the math behind this incredible privilege. Let's walk through a tiny micro-example. Say a customer asks their bank for a 10,000 euro loan. The bank only has to deposit between 1 and 3%. So let's just say 100 euros with the central bank. Once they do that, literally at the push of a button, the bank is allowed to transfer 10,000 euros to the customer's account. They just generated 10,000 euros of electronic money from 100 euros, and they get to collect the interest on the full amount. It's practically a license to print money.
Section 3. The winners, speculators, and billionaires flipping companies and real estate with cheap debt. Okay, so if banks can just invent money and lend it out incredibly cheaply, who exactly is borrowing it all? The answer is the global casino economy. Speculators, ultra-wealthy investors, and massive private equity firms are given practically free access to this invented money, and they use it to buy up companies and real estate, fueling this massive concentration of wealth right at the very top.
To really understand how lucrative this game is, our source material highlights a fascinating case study, the buyout of the renowned German manufacturer WMF. A New York-based private equity firm called KKR bought WMF using predominantly borrowed money. Notice the leverage here. They only put down 100 million euros of their own capital, but they borrowed a massive 560 million euros from banks at incredibly low interest rates.
So the crucial point is what happened next. Just 4 years later, KKR turned around and sold WMF to a French group for 1.6 billion euros. After repaying that super cheap bank loan, KKR walked away with a clean profit of 940 million euros. Because they only put in 100 million of their own cash, that is a staggering 800% return. And it is entirely driven by the fact that global markets are currently flooded with exceptionally cheap borrowed money.
Former London financial star Geraint Anderson gives us a really stark insider's look at this culture. He explicitly calls this dynamic asymmetrical risk. He points out that in the financial sector, you can make highly reckless decisions with other people's borrowed money. If the bet pays off, you make huge amounts of cash. But if the bet fails, well, maybe you lose your job, but you certainly aren't personally liable for the massive institutional debts. It heavily favors wealthy speculators and aggressively encourages short-term gambling.
So, how did we arrive at this massive financial expansion in the first place? Well, our source material maps out a chronological shift across a few different administrations. Back in 1971, U.S. President Nixon ended the gold standard, which completely removed the physical cap on money creation. Then, in the 1980s, Margaret Thatcher deregulated the banks in London, and in the 1990s, Bill Clinton did the exact same thing on Wall Street. Impartially speaking, this historical shift allowed banks to act internationally, accelerating financial transactions and basically untethering the whole financial industry from the real economy of everyday goods and services.
Section 4. The losers, savers, and startups, the real-world cost of a speculative bubble. Because while speculators are busy riding this wave, there's a very real socioeconomic fallout happening on the ground. Let's connect this macro-level global speculation back down to the middle class. The ultra-wealthy can act globally, right? If a real estate bubble pops in Munich, they just shift their money to Rio or Tokyo. But ordinary savers and innovative young businesses, they are deeply rooted locally, and they are the ones paying the price.
Take global real estate, for example. In London right now, beautiful family muse houses are selling for £5 to £7 million. And who's buying them? A lot of the time, it's anonymous offshore corporations. There are over 40,000 properties in London owned by anonymous entities, and many just sit completely empty as speculative objects. This prices out regular folks, like Alf Townsend. He's been a London taxi driver for 54 years, and now he has to live far outside the city center because a simple single-room apartment can cost £1 million.
And honestly, this imbalance totally extends to the business world too. We just saw how easily a private equity firm could borrow 560 million euros to buy an established company. But contrast that with Lauren Hahn. His startup team in Munich developed the Scion, a really innovative, inexpensive, highly eco-friendly electric car powered by solar cells. Yet, when they went to the banks for a loan, flat out denied. Banks view sustainable startups as too risky because they don't have hard assets to repossess if things go south. So despite the world absolutely drowning in cheap money, actual real-world innovators are completely starved of funding.
Section 5. Fixing the financial system. Proposals for a regulated future. Clearly, this system is functioning like an upward redistribution machine. But what can actually be done about it? The economists and activists featured in our sources present some very specific structural solutions to try and rein this whole system back in. Let's take a look.
Here are the main fixes proposed to curb this massive deluge of money. First, they suggest higher capital requirements, meaning big banks would have to cover their loans with significantly more of their own money. They also propose a global tax on speculative financial transactions to throw some sand in the gears and slow down that relentless snowballing of trades. They mention holding international debt conferences to mutually waive massive state debts. And finally, there is a major push for something called fully backed money.
A prime example of this is an initiative currently coming out of Switzerland. Their goal? They want to completely strip private banks of the privilege to create electronic deposit money out of thin air. Instead, they want to restrict money creation solely to the national bank. Under this proposed system, private banks would only be allowed to issue loans if they actually have the money physically sitting in their vaults, making them 100% secure. Advocates believe this would restore balance and ensure that the billions in interest currently being pocketed by private banks would flow into the public purse instead.
It's an absolutely incredible proposal that strikes right at the heart of how our modern world operates. But it does leave us with a critical, lingering thought. As the global casino continues to spin, with 705 trillion euros in speculative bets towering over our actual, real economy, will these structural changes happen in time to prevent the dam from bursting? Or is the next massive financial disaster already fully baked into the system? It for sure makes you question the true security of those pennies sitting in your savings account right now. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep asking those big questions and keep learning.